Howdy folks, welcome back for another Feature Friday. I'm your host Ryan Glover, and this week we're going to be talking about OAuth2. So something we looked at a few weeks ago was the integrations panel inside of Command, the upcoming SaaS product from Clever Beagle. And when we worked on it, I had the integrations panel on a completely different page. But since then, what I've done is I've moved that work we did, and this is exactly the same work. So I took the component, renamed a few things, and just moved it into a new place. So what I've done is I've moved it under the Settings tab of a product in Command. So if I go back to our products list, I go to Bacon, Settings, this is under Integrations here. And like the name implies, the idea here is that these tools are going to integrate with Command. So as you can see here, all the little descriptions that we were writing in the last time are showing up here, but we can see if we connect to GitHub, we'll see repository activity on cards. And again, cards are the things that you're using to track the work on your product. So you can see repository activity on your cards. When you do a release to your public roadmap, so back over here, if you have versions, you'll be able to release a version to your public roadmap and it'll show up here. When you do that, you're going to be able to send that to your mailing list on MailChimp, as well as post tweets and send something to Facebook. So what I wanted to do today is talk about the GitHub integration. Now, we're not going to go into the details of how GitHub is going to be used directly, meaning we're not going to talk about how to use their API, but what I am going to show you is arguably the harder part of this equation, which is connecting to GitHub via OAuth2. And what that means is, and you've definitely come across this before, so when you visit a third-party website and they want to connect to some other service, so in this case we'll say GitHub, so we'll just like a continuous integration service, so one where you push your code to a repository and then they manage the actual deployment to servers. So it's likely that one of those services is going to need to connect to your GitHub account. So when you click the button connect, what's going to happen is you'll be presented with a new page or a pop-up that says, do you authorize insert CI service here to connect to your GitHub account and access this information, where this information are the different things that that third party has asked GitHub to provide to them via OAuth. So that whole mechanism is known as OAuth login. And so there's two different versions of it. So there's 1.0, which is an absolute dumpster fire of an idea, and 2.0, which a lot of people don't like, but it's not too bad, which is what GitHub is using here, is a little bit smoother. But the process is that once we've clicked connect to GitHub, not only do we have to handle that transaction of showing the user that pop-up or taking them to that new page to authorize the app, we also have to handle what happens after we get a response from GitHub to say, hey, okay, you're allowed to access this user's information. So we're going to talk through what that looks like. And so back here in the UI, what I've got is our list of different integrations that we can use. And for GitHub, the idea is if I've never used this before, meaning this is the very first time that I've used Command, I've never set up any integrations, what I'm going to see is this connect button. And when I click it, it's going to try and connect me to the service. Now, what just happened there is I've already connected this application. So what I'm going to do before we finish up is I'll go ahead and remove Command from, I'm doing this on the Clever Beagle GitHub account, so I'll remove Command as one of the authorized apps on that account, and we'll see the full process from start to finish. But the idea is when I click connect, I'm going to be booted to that page, and then it's going to authorize me on GitHub. GitHub's going to give me an access token, and then I'm going to be able to store that access token so I can make requests on behalf of whoever the current user is, or whoever the user is that authorized GitHub. So in this case, that would be the GitHub user, not the user of Command. And that's kind of the confusing part. So literally, whatever service you're connecting to, we're getting authorized to use that service on the user's behalf, if that makes sense. So what I'm going to do now is jump over to the code, and we're going to look at the basic UI. So we're still looking at this UI in the code right now. And what I've got pulled up here is the settings panel component we worked on. And here I've got this button, which is calling to a function handle connect to service on click. Very simple stuff. But you'll notice that I'm passing the name of the service as a string to that function. And that has a point. You'll notice that I'm doing that for all the others. So we've got MailChimp, Twitter, and Facebook as well down here. So if we go up to that function and we take a look at it, what it's doing is it's taking in service and it's setting us up to actually go to a login URL. Now, the way this is written is designed to be as flexible as possible so that we could have an infinite number of integrations. So each service is a little bit different, which is mildly infuriating because the whole point of OAuth is that it's a standard that should be followed, but I've found that every different service has different ways of labeling certain things. It's not always consistent, and so you kind of have to bring that consistency to your own code. So that's what's going on here. And if we look at handle connect to service, what I'm doing is trying to figure out what is the URL that I'm going to redirect this user to when they click that button, that connect button. And so in this case right now, I'm only up through GitHub and I'm partway through the Twitter integration, and you'll see some fun comments in here about that in a little bit. But we're just focusing on this GitHub one. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying I need to get back a URL, and when I say URL, I mean literally just a string that I can redirect the browser to. So you'll notice that the very final step of handle connect to service is just overriding the current location of the current window, meaning the browser window. So I'm overriding that location with whatever I get back as login URL. Now the funky part here is this syntax. You probably, if you're not experienced with something like this, you're probably like, what in the hell is that? So what's going on here is I'm saying that I need to get back that login URL that we can pass to window location. So that's the end goal. But to do it, the problem that I had to solve here was, again, this goes back to everybody doing this differently, is for GitHub, all I need is a string. I don't need to do anything special. I just need to build a string and then return that string. And you'll notice that I've got a fun comment here, just to remind myself why I did this. You'll notice that I have this function get GitHub OAuth URL. So if we come back down here, the way that I'm getting to that function is I'm saying, okay, on this object, so ignore the await for a second, and also ignore the parentheses. We'll get to that. So just focus on this part. So what I'm saying is on this object, I want to match the service that's passed to this function. So this is just bracket notation on an object. So what we're saying is find me the service, or the service name is a better way to say this. So find me the service name on this object and return its value to me. So literally that's what this is doing. And we've talked about this in other Feature Fridays. So if you gotta go back, you'll see some different variations of this. But the idea is we want to get back either GitHub or Twitter in this case, and then later we'll have MailChimp and Facebook as well. But for now, it's just GitHub and Twitter. So if the service that I clicked on was GitHub, I expect to match this value, which is going to return this.getGitHubOauth URL. So it's just going to return me the function. And again, we're just focused on that part. Now, where this should start to make a little more sense is, okay, if that's going to return me this value, which is assigned to a function, then that means that as soon as that value is returned or evaluated by JavaScript, I can call that function immediately and use it, which is exactly what we're doing. So right here, immediately after we get that response value, I'm saying call that function, whichever one was returned, and this is a design thing. This isn't like a default behavior in JavaScript. So for example, if I added, we'll just say MailChimp, and instead of a function MailChimp return 3, this code would have a runtime error. It wouldn't work. So I'm assuming, because I've designed it that way, that this is going to return a function I can call. And so with the GitHub one, I'm saying call get GitHub, this.get GitHub OAuth URL, it's hard to say, and pass it product and settings. And now kind of going back up and demystifying these two lines. So product is literally the product that we're looking at in the browser. So that product is loaded into memory by GraphQL. And so I have access to things like the ID of the product, the name of the product, all the information about it. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying just go ahead and toss that entire product to that, because we're going to use some parts of that product's data to tell us what we're doing and where we're going. We'll see that in a second. So I'm passing that product, and then I'm also passing settings. And you'll notice that settings is pointing to meteor.settings.public.integrations, and then I use bracket notation again. So this line here, this part of this line here, is identical in behavior to this. The only difference is this object lives in the settings file for the project and not immediately in this file. So this object is defined here. This, up until the brackets, this object is defined in a settings file. And I'd show you that, but it's got some sensitive information in it, so I'm not going to pull it up because I don't really feel like blurring and doing all that jazz. So what we're doing is we're saying on that integrations object, find the service that matches. Again, same exact idea. So if I was to kind of mock that out, what we'd have is integrations in our settings file, and then on that we'd have an object like GitHub, and then I know one of the properties it's going to have is login URL. So literally the URL that we're trying to redirect the user to. And so what's going on here is I'm saying, okay, grab all the information that you can about GitHub. Only this object, that's it. So once we have that, we pass that along to the function we're calling. So again, this is going to be get GitHub OAuth URL, because service here is used here to target the property on this object here, which is going to return whatever the value is that's assigned to that property on that object that matches the name of the service that was passed. So with all of that, now what we're going to do, and we'll come back down here to kind of close the loop on this mentally. So if we go up to get GitHub OAuth URL, again, I'm using a promise here. Now this is totally, well, I actually said it. This is as dumb as it looks, but it will save headaches later. So the reason I did this, and depending on what integrations you're working with in your own product or what OAuth2 services, or OAuth services, I shouldn't say OAuth2, OAuth services you're working with, you're going to have to do things in a slightly different way. So the reason I'm using a promise here is because of Twitter. And Twitter, their OAuth cycle, the one that I need, so they have, I think it was 2 different variants. They have one where I can just do an OAuth login as the app. So in this case, if I had a Twitter account for Command that I wanted to post tweets on the behalf of Command for, I can do an OAuth2, I think they do OAuth2 login for that variant, so I can use that. But when it comes to having to do things on the behalf of a user, which is what Command is trying to do, I'm trying to authenticate as one of you and then post tweets to your whatever account you connect for me on your behalf. So when that's the case, you're using OAuth1, which is quite the doozy of a process. So the reason that I had to do this is because just in order to get the URL back that I need to log someone in with for Twitter, I need to first make a trip to the server and make a request to Twitter just to get the credentials to generate the URL that then generates the login for me. So it's like this I think at the end of the day, it's like 5 or 6 different steps for OAuth1 to log somebody in. So it's a total nightmare. The long story short here is that because I have to make that extra trip to the server in order to just get the information I need to log the user in or to generate that login URL, I'm using a promise here to wait on that value or that response to come back. So by using a promise, what I can do down here is I'm saying I can await that login URL before I try and set window.location, which is super convenient. So keep in mind the reason that I'm doing all this, the reason I'm writing this the way I am is to make this as reusable as possible. So in order to achieve that reusability and make this as flexible as humanly possible, just by virtue of Twitter needing that promise, I have to use a promise on all of my other OAuth services or the string generations, even though I technically don't need it. For the sake of consistency, it's helpful and it's important. So that's exactly why I'm doing that inside of get GitHub OAuth URL. So I'm saying return a new promise. And we'll notice that it doesn't really do anything. It's literally just resolving immediately with a string. But that consistency is allowing me to have super clean code down here without a bunch of nonsense. So if we go back up to that function and just look and focus on the string that's being returned, this should start to make a little sense. So again, we're trying to get a URL as a string that we can redirect the user to or redirect the browser to. So if we look here, we've got product and settings. So again, product is the entire product object describing the current product where we're accessing the integrations list for. And settings is from the settings file. So that's the OAuth or integration settings for whatever service we clicked on, or in this case, GitHub. So with that information, I'm saying, okay, I know there's going to be a base URL where I'm going to log in. And this is, I'm not going to remember this, but it's something like api.github.com/OAuth/authorize, something to that effect. And so that's the core part of the URL that we're trying to generate. But, and now this is the interesting part, is in order to actually authorize the user, we have to provide certain query parameters in that URL or on that URL that GitHub recognizes so that we can tell it, hey, this is the command app and not, you know, I don't know, insert some goofy startup name like Tadoodle into the name. So in order to do that authentication process, what we have to do is say, okay, here's our login URL, and then everything again after the question mark is a query param. We know that immediately, and that's not a JavaScript convention or anything like that. That's just how browsers work. That's how URLs work. That's how HTTP works. And so we're saying, okay, everything after this question mark is a query parameter. So we're saying that response type is 1, and we're setting that to code. And then I'm saying client ID equals, and we'll notice that I'm assigning this. So I'm using backticks here to designate that I'm going to do string interpolation, or I'm going to inject values into a string that are dynamic. So in this case, the dynamic value at this point is settings.clientID. Now you may be looking at this syntax like, what is going on here? This is just the formatting tool that's used inside of PUP. So this is Prettier. So Prettier is very fussy about how you format your lines and twist your lines and do all of that. So don't think that this is some new fun way of writing JavaScript. This is just Prettier trying to squish everything into lines. You get used to it. And it actually does help later on for keeping stuff really consistent. But the idea here is that at this point where I'm using, so the $ braces, when this gets evaluated, settings.clientID in this case is going to be injected into the string at that point. And so literally client ID here is, in OAuth2 you have a client ID and you have a client secret. And so the pair of those two keys is what you use to identify and authenticate yourself with a third-party service that's using OAuth login. So the client ID is something that's public. That's something that is just a general identifier. It's saying, hey, this is who I am. And then the secret is what you use to actually do something with the value that's given back to you by the third-party service. And we'll see all that later. But just know that there's two parts to this. And the first is client ID, which is just saying, hey, this is the command app trying to authenticate a user. That's it. The next part, and you'll see all of our query params after the question mark are concatenated with AND, or the AND symbol. So we're saying, here are query params. So we've got response type, and client ID, and redirect URI. So redirect URI is saying this is where I want you to send the user back to after they've approved or denied the request. And so in this case, what I'm doing, we'll ignore this for just a second. Let's just focus on the value that's being passed. So the value that's being passed is pulling from settings.redirect URI. So settings.redirect URI is kind of a two-sided thing, sort of. So the redirect URI is where we want to send GitHub back to in our application after that process is complete. And so if we go back, what I'm doing, this isn't a command, this is the Clever Beagle GitHub, but this is the exact same stuff you would set up, so this should make some sense. So what I've done here is I've kind of mocked out what I've placed into GitHub for command. And the thing that we're looking at or talking about right now is this. So authorization callback URL, or back over here we call it the redirect URI, same thing. What we're doing here is we're saying this is where we want GitHub to send us after the user's authenticated. So in this case, we're saying send us back to this address, and you'll notice that it's at /integration/OAuth/GitHub. Now, we'll get into the details of this later, but the idea is that this is a server-side route that's going to be able to process the response that GitHub sends us and perform the authentication. That's all we need to know for now. But the URL here, and this is, keep in mind, this is something we're telling GitHub about, so they're going to expect this to match what we send them from the client back over here as settings redirect URI. And that's more, that's an, what's the word I'm looking for? Like an authorization technique. They're making sure that everything lines up so that you're not spoofing somebody else's app or something like that. So we know that if this URL matches what we pass here, we're good to go. And alongside with the client ID, that means that, okay, this is definitely a request coming from the command app. So once we have that, the next thing, and I just realized I have a typo here. No, I don't. I take that back. I don't have a typo. The next thing we're doing is we're adding another query string to the end of that. And this is where this might get a little confusing. So redirect URI is a totally separate URL. So it's literally this. And now what we're doing is we're going to add some query parameters onto the end of that URL. So literally the URL that we're using to give to GitHub to redirect back to our application. There we go. So what I'm doing is I'm passing two values on the end of it. Now these are custom values. This is for me. This isn't for GitHub. So what these are saying, so I've got LT and PID. And we'll notice that those are pointed to Meteor login token and product ID. So the idea here is that even though I know for a fact that no one could come to this page without being logged in and owning this product, I still have to worry about somebody trying to spoof this request. And so in order to get around that, there's two things that I know will be true if this is an actual authentic request, like meaning it's coming from the user for the product that's intended. And that is the login token. So the login token in Meteor is a randomly generated token. Yes, application. So the login token is a randomly generated token by Meteor when a user logs into the application. Now you may be thinking like, wait a minute, why are you showing me this? This isn't insecure. So there's two kind of parts to this. So the login token is a hashed value. So it's just a token that represents a login attempt by the user. So what we're able to do, and notice I'm inside of the local storage values for the current domain. So Meteor stores these values in local storage. So if you have your own Meteor app that you're working with and you log in, you'll see the same exact information. You'll see different values, of course, but you'll see login token, expires, and user ID. You'll see all that stuff in your local storage value. So this login token is a unique value that's secure, meaning in order for me to do anything with this value, I have to hash it on the server. So even if somebody got a hold of this value, there's not really much they can do with it. And so what I need to do is take that value and pass it along with my request over to GitHub. So think of this like it's just luggage. So we're getting on the airplane with extra luggage, and that extra luggage is that login token, and then PID is pretty self-explanatory. That's the product ID. So we're telling ourselves who's the user making the request and what product are they trying to add this integration for. And so what's neat is I can add that information to the end of that redirect URI, and GitHub will just include it for me. It won't think anything of it. It'll include some values itself, but it will also keep those other values and pass them along, which is a really nice way for us to do additional authentication in addition to the OAuth2 login for the user. So what we're doing is once we have that whole URL, you'll notice that I'm passing it to encode URI component. Now this is a JavaScript function. This is global, so this isn't something that I've imported or anything like that. This is something that if you popped open your console here, and let's clear this out. So if we say encode URI component, you'll notice that it's globally defined. And what this is doing is it's clearing up the characters. So we'll just say test.com/hello world. So what it's going to do is it's going to sanitize or convert the character, the ASCII characters inside of a URL to be these random funky percent number letter pairs. So these are, I'm going to use the wrong terminology, but they're the ASCII codes. I know they're not ASCII codes, they're something else. But principles. What this is it's an identifier that tells the browser, hey, this means a colon, this means a slash, this means a slash. So basically it's just making it safe to pass as part of another URL, which if we consider what's going on here, it's exactly what we're doing. So we're saying this outer URL is going to contain an inner URL called redirect URI. And again, that's the value we're going to give to GitHub. Once GitHub finishes, it's going to redirect us back to that URL. So that's all that's happening there. So that is part of it. And there's one more part I do want to point out, which is the scope query parameter. And so this is coming after the redirect URI. So this isn't part of the redirect URI. This is its own thing. This is on the main URL, the main login URL that we're trying to generate. And so what this is doing is it's telling GitHub, these are the things that we want access to for the user that's trying to authenticate. And in this case, I've kind of thought ahead here and I've said, well, I'm going to need to get access to the user's repos, because one of the integrations I'm going to do is kind of matching when you mention a card number inside of one of your commits. I need to be able to get information about those commits, which means I need the repo scope in GitHub. And the way that I know that is back over here. So on GitHub, and I don't think it's on this page. They have it linked. So scopes are just different kind of high-level authorizations that you can have for a third-party service. Now, I think scopes are particular to OAuth2. I don't think they're used for OAuth1 at all. But what they're doing is it's like if you've ever had roles in an application, like this user is an admin, or this user is a customer, or this user is a super admin, something to that effect. This is the same kind of idea, except it's just made generic so that we can apply it to this third-party service, or in this case, GitHub. So what we have are repo, and this is all explained on their site. So you have this high-level repo that gives you full access to private and public repos, and then you have this one, user, which gives you access to the user's information. And so those are the two scopes that I've asked for, but you can see there's a bunch of other stuff in here that you can ask the user to grant you permission to use or access, depending on what your application is doing. So back here in the code, this scope value is saying repo, and then %20 is a space, and that's just a GitHub convention. They say separate your scopes by a space. So they're saying repo space user. So those are the two scopes or permissions that I'm asking for. So with all of that, let's make sure I didn't break something, because I'm always breaking stuff on these. Okay, we're good. So at that point, now we should be getting back the URL that we want. And again, the promise is just to keep everything consistent. There's nothing really significant or related to GitHub in this case. It's just purely consistency, so it matches how the Twitter one works. So this await, this async thing, are saying we're expecting this function to return a promise. And again, I say this function because eventually what's going to happen here, we're going to get back a function. So in this case, just assume that this says this.github URL, and then pass parentheses on the end with product and settings. You know what I mean. So assume that's what has happened here. And we know that that function is, in fact, returning a promise. So we can see it. And here we're doing an implicit return. So if the only thing that a function is doing in JavaScript is returning a value, you can skip the curly braces in the return keyword and just immediately return or specify the value, and whatever comes immediately after the arrow in your function is going to be returned. So it's implicitly returned. So once we've done that, we're returning that promise function, we're awaiting it. So again, we're awaiting it because the Twitter one has to make a trip to the server. So we literally have to wait on it to respond to us. It's relatively instantaneous, depending on your internet connection, but we have to wait on that before we try and redirect the user, otherwise this whole house of cards falls down. So because we're trying to stay consistent, we say await for everything, and in this case, the GitHub one resolves immediately, so it's not something we have to really fuss with. So the idea being that once we finish this out, we're going to set window location to login URL, and we're going to get a redirect. So if we go back over to the app, and let's close this out, and I connect. And again, I got to dump the values on GitHub. So once I do that, we can see that I kind of got redirected, but I ended up back here, and we'll see why that is. But let me go ahead and dump this real quick, and then we'll see what a complete request cycle looks like. Alrighty, so we're all reset there, and what we're going to do now is see what this actually looks like. So before, when I was clicking connect, it was just instantly refreshing, and the reason why is because I had already approved the app, so we weren't having to go and authorize the app again. But if we could go ahead and click connect now, what we'll notice is we get redirected to our login URL, and we can see all the stuff that we put into that URL. So we can see response type, we've got our client ID, we've got our redirect URI, and we've also got our scopes on the end here. So what I'm going to do, so I'm trying to authorize the Clever Beagle GitHub account to say like, yeah, command can access that. So if I say authorize, we'll notice that I get redirected and eventually I end up back at this screen, which may seem a little confusing. So the reason that happened is because there's a bunch of stuff happening behind the scenes on the server side of this. So even though we didn't really see any of it happening, keep in mind that that redirect URI is important. So if we go back, and I'm trying to think of how I can show it to you without, well, let's do this. Let's try and dump command again and see if we can get back to that page. So we'll revoke command. Yeah, I understand. So let's refresh this, see if we can get back over there. There we go. So this redirect URI, notice, so it's saying I want to go to, this is where we gotta be kind of persnickety. Here we go. Okay, so it's saying localhost 3000, and even though these characters are converted, this is saying /integrations /OAuth/GitHub. So that's where GitHub is going to send us back to as soon as I click this button. Now that URL may not be immediately obvious, and the reason why is that it's defined on the server. It's not a client-side URL. So if I go to versions, we'll see that this URL updated, but a server-side URL is one that doesn't render anything back to the user. It's purely for, that's kind of a silly term. I don't know if this is the right way to describe it, but it's like back-end access. So it's never going to be publicly exposed for something like what the user is going to see in the browser. It's only for communicating information between your app and something outside of the app. There you go. That's a good way to say it. So the way that that's set up, so we'll notice that in here I've got a route defined called /integration /OAuth/ and then I say :service. So to kind of speed up here and explain what's going on, here I'm using a package called Meteor Hacks Picker. This is something that I've used for a long time. This is a package that allows you to define server-side routes in your Meteor application. So what that means is Meteor is running a server for you behind the scenes. So it's running on port 3000, or at least it is right now because I told it to start on port 3000. So the application is already running. What Picker does behind the scenes is it attaches to that existing connection or that existing server and allows us to define additional routes on it. So where we're used to defining routes in the browser, this is again only defining the route in the server context. So a brief crash course on HTTP requests. So even though what we end up seeing in the browser is /products/ID settings general, before that ever happens, if I just go directly to that URL, and you'll notice if you watch, the URL flashes a little bit. So see how it hit login? What's going on there is there's an HTTP request from the user to this URL, and the very first thing that hits is the server. So when that hits the server, what's happening is the server saying, what do I do with this? Now in this case, because there's not a server-side route defined, in Meteor's kind of process, the way that it's handling this, it's saying, okay, there's nothing that I need to return immediately via server-side route, so let me just go ahead and render the client like normal. And then when the client takes over, our client-side code recognizes this pattern and is then rendering the UI that we see before us. So this isn't rendered by the server, this is rendered just by the browser. This is rendered by React Router, if we get into the technical terms of what's doing all this. So again, crash course, not deep dive. If you do have questions, post them below or send me an email or something on Twitter and I'll be happy to answer. So what this is helping us to do is to create that server-side route that we can see with that initial request. So when the initial request comes into the server, this will now exist and we'll be able to get to it. And so what I've done here is in the API directory of pup. So again, command is being built with pup. So this is all publicly available over on GitHub at github.com/cleverbeagle/pup. So you can clone a copy of the exact same framework that I'm using to build all this stuff with. So in the API directory, I've added the public directory, and inside of there I have index.js. And this file is used to define those server-side routes. So before this gets too confusing, I do want to point out that I had to load this file. So I've created it, but it's not loaded onto the server in any way. So what I'm doing is in the startup server API.js file, all the way down here, I thought I put it at the top. There it is. I put it alphabetically. So I'm importing that file into API.js, which if we look, so I've got startup server index.js is loading the API. So this file is responsible for loading all of these other files onto the server. And so by virtue of loading the API, that's loading the public file, which is loading this. So punchline being, we're loading this code onto the server when it starts up. So what we're saying here is we're saying, okay, we know that we're going to have multiple services. So we want a generic endpoint of /integration/OAuth. But we need to know which service are we trying to handle. So here we're doing a route parameter. And this may look familiar. So this is fairly consistent across any routing package or library that you use. So the route parameters are anything prefixed with a colon. So that's saying it's kind of like a variable in the URL. So we don't know what service is going to be. It could be GitHub, it could be Twitter, it could be MailChimp, it could be anything. We don't know what it's going to be. So by creating that wildcard, we give ourselves a way to flip between different functionality when this route is hit. So again, back in the browser, no, we lost it. Can't get to it. So when we were looking at the redirect URI is what I'm getting at. We had /integration/OAuth/GitHub. So in this case, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, when that matches, we're going to fire this function. So literally when that URL is visited in our application. So again, localhost 3000 /integrations/OAuth/GitHub in this case. So again, this is what GitHub has been told to redirect back to after the user has authorized our access. So GitHub redirects us to here. The server sees it, says, yep, I recognize that URL. And then what we do inside of the function is we check. So we say, if params.service, and params here is going to contain a few different things. So it's going to contain your route params, and it's also going to contain query params. So remember, query params are testing equals 1, 2, 3. So the query param here is testing, and its value is 1, 2, 3. It's also going to have those, if any, exist on the URL included. So what we're saying is, if the service exists and the service equals GitHub, we're going to call this function GitHub. And we can see I'm importing this from integrations GitHub in the current directory. So in public, I have an integrations directory and I have a github.js file. So if we go ahead and open that up, starting at the bottom, this is using the action pattern. This is something that I've used for a while now as a way to just structure my code. It's just a JavaScript pattern, but it helps me to understand the flow of what's happening in really complex multi-step processes. And I'll post a link down below so you can see what exactly that entails and how to use it for your own stuff. But let's go ahead and step through this. So keep in mind that at this point, we've redirected the user to GitHub, they've authorized us, and GitHub has redirected us back to one of these files. There it is. This URL right here. So that URL is now calling or triggering this function, GitHub. And now this is kind of the end of the road, so to speak, for this process. So in order to complete the authentication process, what we have to do is call back to GitHub. So I'm going to skip over some of the stuff here, and we'll highlight it in a second. So the thing that I'm looking for is right here, get access token. So you'll notice up at the top of the function here, I'm saying GitHub authorization code is equal to, and I'm using the lodash.get method to say from the params object. So options here is a value passed to this function. And if we go back and look at the value passed, it's this single object, one of the values which is params. So I'm accessing that value right here. So I'm saying from options, I want the params value. And then lodash.get helps me to avoid the whole and that kind of syntax when you have a nested value on an object. It helps to avoid that. So what I'm saying is take params and try to get query.code. So options.params.query.code. Try and give me that value back. And if for some reason you can't get to it, just return null. So that's part one. So that's me getting the authorization code that GitHub sends back to us. Now, the authorization code is not something that we ever really see. that is the end result of the user authenticating us on GitHub. So when you click the green button and you say, yep, they're allowed to get to my stuff, when GitHub sends the response back to us, so when they go to our redirect URI, they include as one of the query params on the end of that URL something called code, which is a unique code that we can then send back to GitHub to say, hey, you said that we have access to their stuff. Can you give us an access token that we can store on our side to make requests in the future? So again, that's API requests in the future. So this code is going to allow us to perform that transaction or to get that permanent access token from GitHub. So with that code, down here I've written another function, and we can kind of see something familiar here. We're doing an await, so we're expecting get access token to return a promise to us. So what I'm doing is I'm passing GitHub authorization code to that function. And then if we jump up to that function, what we're doing is we're making a post request. So you can see here I've pulled in settings again. So earlier we talked only about the public settings because we were only on the client side. So there's kind of two sets of values that we have to keep in mind here. There's stuff that's meant for the public and stuff that's meant for just us privately on the server. So I'm grabbing those two values and I'm just storing them in variables, so this is a little easier to digest. So I'm saying, okay, from GitHub public settings, I want to pass our client ID, and then you'll also notice I'm passing the client secret. So remember earlier when I talked about creating a new OAuth application on GitHub, we get back two values. We get back client ID and client secret. This is where the secret comes into the equation. So client ID here is the same exact one that we passed in the login URL to GitHub earlier. Same exact one. So this is kind of the consistent key that helps us to identify with GitHub. Now on the server side, and at this specific point, what we're doing is we're actually asking for a permanent token that will allow us to perform actions on behalf of the user that's connecting to GitHub. So what that means is it's a little more secure. It's got to be a little more hardcore. So not only do we pass the client ID, but we pass the secret to make sure that the two match. And then we also pass that temporary code that GitHub gave us as part of the return value to the redirect URI. So on the redirect URI, it added the query param code. That's what we're passing here. So this final step is saying, in order to get the access token, again, this is the permanent access token to make requests on behalf of our user. What we're saying is post to GitHub at this URL. So this is a totally different URL from the one we generated earlier. So now this is the second step. This is saying go to /login/OAuth/access token and pass in the data or in the body of the request, because this is a post request, these three values. And those three values are going to tell GitHub whether or not we're actually allowed to get back an access token. And if we are, we're going to get back an access token. So if we go down and we look at the rest of our code, so we get access token response, which is just this big object that says, like, here's what they sent back. And you'll notice that I'm using a library called Axios. So Axios is just an HTTP library. Not much special about it. I just prefer it over some of the other options that are out there. And I also like it because it doesn't directly couple this code to Meteor, so if I want to port it later, I can. It's not something that's fixed. So I'm using Axios to do our post request, which responds with a big object if GitHub responds in the positive. And so the next step after I get that response, so this is where we're making the request. And because we're doing an await, we're waiting on that promise to return. So when it returns, it's just going to return the value back to this variable. So literally, if we get a positive response, it'll be stored in this variable access token response. And so on that value, again, I'm using lodash.get to avoid the trail of and symbols. So I'm saying from that, give me access token response .data.access token. And now at this point, this is literally, this is firepower. This is the access token that will give us access to perform the tasks that fall under the repo scope and user scope that we saw ourselves making a request for earlier. So this is serious. So you don't want to screw around with this. So at this point, we have that access token, and you'll notice the very next thing I do is I set that access token on the user's product. So when you connect an integration and command, I'm storing it in the database on your product. So what that's allowing me to do is to check and see, regardless of the user that's logged in, do we have access to some integration for that product? And so that makes it that Say you're a part of a team and you have 3 team members working on a product in command, and then one of you leaves, but that was the person who set up the integration. You don't have to worry about it dropping off when they delete their account or you delete their account. It'll keep working. So that's what this is achieving. It's allowing me to just assign this access token that we get from GitHub back to their product. Now, the final step of this, and we'll kind of explain how we got to product ID and all that real quick, but the final step of this, you'll notice I'm seeing options.res.writehead 302. So what this is doing, if we look back in our public file, so this is our API endpoint, we're saying, okay, call GitHub and pass params rec, which is request, and res, which is response. So those are just objects with different values that we can use to parse the request that was given to us or respond to the request that was given to us. So at this point, we're done with all of our work. We're happy, we've got an access token, everything's worked out, or should have. And so we're saying, okay, now we're done. What do we do next? And so what I'm doing here is a 302 redirect. So 302 is an HTTP code that tells the browser to redirect the user to some other URL. And you'll notice that that has 2 arguments passed to it. So this write head function, it takes the code. So we're saying write the head of 302. So we're saying that's the response code. And then we're passing an object with some properties. So in this case, location is where we're redirecting the user to. So it's a 302 redirect, but then the question is, where are they going? That's where this location header comes in. We're saying perform a 302 redirect to this URL in the application. And because I've written it this way, so I could hard code the URL, or I could do, what is it? It's Meteor absolute URL. If I wanted to get the current URL of the application, I wanted this to literally be an absolute path. But in here, I'm just using relative. So I'm saying, okay, well, I know I'm on the correct domain already, so just redirect inside of that domain to /product ID /settings /integrations, or back to this page. So literally, once we've completed this loop, we've got the access token, we've stored it in our database, we want to redirect the user back to this page. Yes, for some reason that tripped me up. It's made a funny face. So yeah, that's what's happening. So we're saying set the head to 302, and then response.end is actually finalizing that process. So we're saying this is what we want to do, now do it. And now do it in this case is us responding to the request that was received at this server-side route. So that's where the response is going back to. We're passing it to this function, which may be a little confusing, but the ultimate idea is that it's going to pop out here, and then it's going to talk to what's assigned to this argument, which behind the scenes is just a Node.js HTTP request, and it's going to respond back to the actual HTTP request saying like, okay, all is well, go ahead and redirect the user back to this URL, which in this case is right here. So that's the kind of the end of this trail. That's how that works. But now there's one more question, and this is super important from a security perspective, which is, well, okay, technically somebody could kind of fuddle with this. And remember earlier I talked about the Meteor user's login token and the product ID being passed along with this initial request. And we can see those being plucked off up here. So again, we have options.params. And remember I talked about this params object having 2 levels. So it's got the route params at its top level, and then nested inside of that params object is a query object, which contains all of the query parameters in addition to the route parameters for that URL that was given to us. So here I'm saying we need to get the product ID. So again, we stored that as a query parameter called PID. And then we also need the login token, which is LT. So in between those is the code that we got from GitHub, which we already covered. So we've got the product ID and the login token. Now remember, login token is an unhashed value, so it doesn't really mean anything until we're on the server. And so if we go and we look at this get user function, what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, first and foremost, if there's not a login token, throw an error, you're not allowed to do what you're doing. Something's wrong. Next, I'm saying get the hashed login token for the user. So this is where we take the login token that we pulled from local storage, and then get user login token is pretty simple. It's just a wrapper around accounts._hash login token. Now accounts is a Meteor package. So if we go up to top, you can see I'm importing accounts from Meteor accounts base. So The thing to keep in mind here is whenever you see an underscore in front of a function inside of a value meter, that means it's a private function. So this is somewhat risque, but it's not the end of the world, and I can kind of explain why. So this is a private function, which means I shouldn't always trust that it's going to exist. But I know for a fact that just based on where Meteor is at in its overall life cycle, this isn't something that's likely to just go poof or that they're going to change, so I can trust it. I know, like, okay, there's a pretty good bet that it's not going to go away. Unless somebody from Meteor's watching this and they hate me, and then they're going to be like, well, watch this, asshole. So that should always exist. And what this is doing is it's creating a hashed copy of the login token, which is matching a value that Meteor sets in the database. So whenever somebody does a login attempt, so they fill out the login form and they hit submit. So what happens as part of that process is Meteor takes in their password and all their information, creates a hash of it, and then it passes it to this hash login token function. And what that's doing is it's generating another string, another hexadecimal string, which is a hash of the password, which represents their login attempt. And that's stored in the database on the user. So the value that I get back here matches that value that should be in the database. So what's happening is inside of getUser, once I have that token, I'm looking for a user in the users collection in Meteor. So meteor.users, I'm looking for a user with services.resume.login tokens.hash matching the hashed response that we just pulled out of the local storage on the client and then have run through hash login token. So I expect that to exist. If it does, wonderful, that means we have a user and all is good to go. If not, we throw the exact same errors up here. So we say that's an invalid login attempt, please contact support, something's not right. So that's step one. So that tells us what user is trying to perform this task. So that's only part of our security. So that's, see, I'm always breaking stuff. There we go, fixed. So that's part one. So that gives us who is this person? We know who it is, what user this is. And then the next thing we do is we check, does the user have access to this product? So we take that product ID along with the ID of the user that we found inside of getUser. And if we go and look at that, all we're doing is pretty simple. We take in the user ID and the product ID and following the schema of that collection. So in this case, the products collection I know is going to have objects with obviously an ID for the product, and it's going to have either a user ID value, which says this is the user ID that owns this product, or it's going to have the user ID, or I should say, yeah, a user ID inside of the has access array, meaning the owner of that product gave this user access to the product. So what I'm doing is I'm running an OR query to say if either of those match, that means that, okay, this user is allowed to do what they're doing. And so what I'm writing here is I'm saying, okay, try and find a product where you can find either this user's ID as the user ID, meaning the owner of the product, or this user ID and has access. And then I'm using a double bang here to say, convert that response to a Boolean value. So this part is going to return an object. It's going to literally return the product if it finds it. And so what I'm saying is, okay, if you get a value back, meaning it's truthy, the double bang is going to convert that to just an actual Boolean true. Or if it doesn't find a product, meaning it was undefined, it's going to convert that to a Boolean false. So a little cleaner, a little tighter, and it makes it a little more predictable for us down below. So now, go back to our main function here. We're saying, okay, does the user have access to the product? So if they don't, I'm going to write an error message, and I'm doing that in two ways. So I'm saying, one, respond to the HTTP request with the 403, which is the HTTP request code for forbidden, meaning you can't do that. And then I'm also throwing an error in the code. So I'm saying, halt this function from even running anymore. We're done, stop it, make sure that we know that like this shouldn't do anything else. And so that just stops the flow at this point. So we respond to the request, but we also stop our JavaScript from evaluating any further. So basically, we won't go down to these lines and try and get an access token. We'll just say, like, yeah, kill it. Don't do anything. And so that's it. So at that point, we've now authenticated that they're allowed to do it. We've gotten the access token from GitHub. We've stored that access token on the user's product so we can reference it later. and we've redirected the user back to the integrations page. So the end result of all this, which I haven't wired up yet, but hopefully between today or sometime over the weekend here, what's going to happen is when I come back to this page, I'm going to fire another query back to the database to say, hey, have they connected this integration before? Have they connected this service? So what I would expect is this button will change from connect to configure or something like that. I haven't really decided yet. So it'll change to configure, and then they'll be able to click that and they'll get a modal with all of the settings for that specific integration. So that'll do it. Whew. OAuth, man, that's a doozy. And that was OAuth2. So just kind of a closing note, if you ever find yourself in this position, OAuth2 is relatively easy compared to OAuth1. OAuth1 is just it's deeply upsetting, put it that way. So with that, that is going to do it for this week's Feature Friday. As always, if you haven't already, click the subscribe button down below or click the bell right next to it if you want to get notifications as soon as these are published. And as always, I'm available on Twitter, so if you want to see something on here, you have any questions or anything like that, either post them below or send a tweet to @CLV. See, now I forgot. CLVRBGL on Twitter. There you go. Alrighty. Well, that's going to do it for me, folks. So signing off for the HMS Beagle. I'll see you next week. You just listened to me run my mouth for the better part of an hour about a bunch of really technical code. So why not commemorate that experience by watching another tutorial and having an absolute psychological meltdown?